The early morning sun filtered through the glass walls of Dallas/Fort Worth International Airport, painting long shafts of light across the terrazzo floors. Zuri Anderson clutched the handle of her small, rolling suitcase, its bright purple stickers, a unicorn, a moon, a sparkly star, bouncing with each hurried step. She could feel her heart hammering beneath her collarbone, each beat echoing the distant hum of arriving and departing jets. At 13, this was her first solo flight, and despite her best efforts to appear composed, her palms were slick with sweat. She took a slow breath. "You've got this," she told herself. Just 3 weeks ago, Zuri had been confined to a hospital bed, fighting off a severe flare-up of chronic bronchitis. The memory of the relentless coughing fits still haunted her. Nights spent tethered to an oxygen monitor, her mother's gentle hand rubbing her back. That vulnerability had nearly forced her to miss this trip. But her mom, single parent, nurse, Zuri's fiercest champion, had insisted. "You need to spread your wings," she'd said, adjusting Zuri's oxygen mask. Not every test is in a classroom. Now, with her mother in surgery back in their cozy East Dallas apartment, Zuri was bound for San Francisco, where her aunt lived in a bright Victorian house near an art museum. The boarding pass in her pocket felt both like a ticket to freedom and a neon sign advertising her loneliness. She smoothed the fabric of her denim jacket and focused on the next checkpoint, the Southwest Airlines desk, where a customer service agent would hand her a fragile paper invitation to the sky. At the counter, Zuri raised her chin and offered a polite smile when the agent greeted her with a tired nod. "Good morning," the man said, scanning her ID. "Flying solo today, Miss Anderson?" He spoke with genuine warmth, probably used to nervous first-timers. She shook her head once. "Yes, sir. I'll be sitting in 17B. He slid her boarding pass across the counter. "Gate C14. Boarding at 9:15. Have a great trip." Zuri tucked the pass safely into her pocket and whispered thanks, as if it were a lifeline. Security was its usual whirlwind. Bins rattling, shoes off, beep beep from the scanner. Her backpack went through with a soft thud. Next came her small, clear pouch of essential items: inhaler, prescription cough medicine, and a sealed bottle of water, just in case. Her pockets jingled with change, and her aunt's telephone number on a slip of paper. When the TSA officer nodded her through, Zuri felt the first glimmer of triumph. She had made it this far. At Gate C14, the waiting area buzzed with families reuniting, business travelers tapping on laptops, and spring breakers in t-shirts from the beach. Zuri found a window seat near the boarding queue and sank into it. She took out her water bottle, still full, and rolled it between her thighs, as if it were a talisman against panic. She watched a jumbo jet taxi past, its silver fuselage glinting. It seemed to mock her, so big and powerful, while she felt so small. A gate agent's voice crackled over the speaker. "Now boarding Group 3. Zuri stood, heart thumping, and joined the line. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the air shifted, recycled but comforting, filled with the scent of jet fuel and faint traces of coffee. She showed her pass, then moved down the aisle until she reached row 17. The purple unicorn sticker on her suitcase caught a flight attendant's eye, and for a moment, Zuri saw kindness flicker in the attendant's expression before it vanished. Inside the cabin, Zuri located seat 17B. She lifted her bag into the overhead bin, straining slightly, and slid into the window seat. The cushion felt worn, the fabric a dull teal. She buckled her seatbelt, delaying the moment she had to sit still and face the unknown. From here, she could see straight through the aisle to the cockpit door ahead and the exit row behind. Her palms were clammy again. She closed her eyes and steadied her breathing, counting to 5 on each inhale and exhale. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a photo. Her mom and her, arms wrapped around each other in the hospital hallway, both smiling even though her mom looked more tired than usual. She whispered, "I'm okay, Mom. I'm doing this." Then she drank a small sip of water, letting the cool liquid soothe her scratchy throat. The engine's roar deepened as the flight attendant made her way down the aisle, checking overhead bins. This was the moment it really began. With the cabin now full and the flight attendant asking everyone to fasten their belts, Zuri felt a flutter of excitement replace some of her nerves. The engine spooled up and the plane began its taxi to the runway. She pressed her forehead lightly against the window's cool frame, watching the terminal fade behind her. Ahead lay 15,000 feet of sky, new sights, and the comfort of her aunt's home. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe. Maybe this trip would be exactly what she needed. Patricia Vaughn stood in the galley at the front of the economy cabin like a warden guarding her domain. At 50 years old, she carried herself with the crisp authority of someone who had spent decades passing judgment on passengers' every move. Her uniform was immaculate, a sharply pressed navy blazer over a white blouse, a neckerchief tied just so, and her hair was pulled back into a tight bun that left no stray strands to soften the lines of her stern face. As she glanced down the aisle, her lips curled into a practiced, polite smile that never reached her eyes. Zuri sat in 17B, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and watched Patricia's approach with a mixture of awe and nervousness. The flight attendant's heels clicked against the floor as she made her way row by row, checking tickets and reminding people to stow their personal items. When she reached 17B, Patricia paused, extended her arm, and took Zuri's boarding pass. Her fingernails were short, square, and painted a neutral beige, unremarkable, like everything else about her. 17B, Patricia said, her voice low and clipped. She didn't make eye contact. Instead, she glanced over Zuri's head at a group of businessmen seated a row ahead, as if already deciding who truly mattered. "Don't cause any trouble back here," she added, sliding the pass back across Zuri's outstretched hand. Then she moved on without another word. Zuri's heart thudded so loudly she was certain Patricia could hear it, or worse, was already judging it. She swallowed and tried to smile politely. "Yes, ma'am," she murmured. Patricia's attention was already focused on the man in 16A who was asking for a second pillow. Zuri sank back into her seat, clutching the armrest as if it were an anchor. Across the aisle, the man in 16A got his pillow within seconds. Meanwhile, Zuri's small request for water had gone unanswered. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The man, a middle-aged white professional in a tailored suit, beamed at Patricia and said, "Thank you so much. You've been wonderful." Patricia replied with effusive warmth, tucking her chin and using a soft tone. Then, just as quickly, she stiffened her posture and turned her back on Zuri's empty cup and quivering lip. Zuri closed her eyes for a moment. She pictured her mother's face, the way she'd smiled at her before jogging her elbow and saying, "Go on, kiddo, you've got this." That thought gave her a little courage. When Patricia had moved past another few rows, Zuri lifted her head and tried again. She pressed the call button just once and waited. Patricia paused mid-step, her shoulder brushing against the overhead bin. She turned slowly, arching one eyebrow. She didn't bother to walk all the way over. Instead, she gave a half smile. "Can't you see I'm busy?" she said, her tone sharper than it needed to be. "You'll get water on the next service round." That next service round could be hours away, if at all. Zuri's throat tightened. She managed to choke out, I just need a little to take my medicine." Her voice was small, but the cabin was quiet enough that several people looked up. Patricia sighed, shook her head, and walked away. She turned back at the first white passenger she saw and asked, "Anything else for you, sir?" Her abrupt shift in tone stung like a slap. Zuri pressed her hand against her mouth, fighting back tears. Her breath came in quick, uneven gasps, and for a moment she worried she was about to start coughing again. She bit her lip until it tasted like copper. Then she gently patted the arm of the seat beside her, pretending to look for something in her bag so no one would think she was crying. A few rows behind, a flight attendant named Luis noticed the exchange. He caught Zuri's eye and offered a sympathetic nod. But Patricia was the senior attendant, and Luis looked away quickly, his expression apologetic but powerless. The rest of the crew drifted by like ghosts, none daring to intervene. Zuri's chest felt tight, like someone was standing on it, and her inhaler was buried at the bottom of her backpack in the overhead bin. She knew she needed to keep calm. Panic would only make her cough harder. Still, each second without water felt like an hour. As Patricia moved further forward, she paused to adjust the beverage cart. Her gaze flicked toward Zuri one more time, calculating and cold. She caught sight of the empty cup again and gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Then she turned her back again, as though Zuri didn't exist. Zuri watched her go, her lip trembling. She pressed her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. The hum of the engines felt too loud. The man who had received the pillow got his coffee next. The man in front of her hummed as he scrolled through emails on his phone. Everyone else seemed normal. No one else was dying of thirst. She thought, what if I don't make it to the next service? She didn't want to think about it. Instead, she took a deep breath and reminded herself that tomorrow she'd be with Aunt Marisol, who ran a gallery in San Francisco and would have all sorts of water bottles. And hot chocolate, too, Zuri hoped. For now, she had to hold on. By the time the beverage cart rolled down her aisle again, Zuri's grip on her armrest was so tight her knuckles went white. Patricia gave her a long, hard look before leaning over the cart. "You were told to wait," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Zuri. "Don't make me write you up." Zuri felt humiliation burn in her cheeks, hotter and sharper than any cough. But she remembered her mother's words, "Stand tall and ask for what you need." She met Patricia's gaze, weak but steady, and said, "I am asking." Her voice cracked, but she didn't look away. The cabin held its breath. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes. Patricia's lips thinned. For a moment, it seemed like she might relent. Then she straightened, picked up her clipboard, and turned to the man 2 rows ahead. Zuri's eyes filled with tears. She didn't wipe them. She wouldn't let Patricia see her cry again. She looked out the window instead, watching clouds drift by. She thought about her mother in Dallas, about her aunt waiting in San Francisco, about all the people who did care. And she waited, because that's what she had to do. In the quiet tension of row 17, Zuri felt every heartbeat as a testament. Even alone, even overlooked, even frightened, she still had the courage to ask. And sometimes, that's where real strength begins. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants settled behind the beverage carts, their soft hum blending with the low drone of jet engines. Zuri's chest tightened every time she coughed, a dry rasping sound that echoed through her nasal mask even though she'd tucked it into her pocket. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and each swallow reminded her how badly she needed water. She glanced down the aisle at Patricia Vaughn, who was busy pouring tea for a passenger in row 16. The attendant's posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if she'd never encountered anyone in distress. Zuri pressed the call button above her seat once, then again. The small light blinked insistently, but Patricia didn't look up. Instead, she leaned toward the man in 16A, asking, "More ice?" And with a smile that dripped with practiced courtesy, she dropped ice cubes into his glass. Zuri's gaze followed the crystals clinking against the glass, each one mocking her own empty cup. Her hand shook as she pressed the call button a 3rd time. She swallowed hard. Maybe if she whispered loud enough, someone else would hear. But her voice came out as a quiet, "Excuse me?" that barely made it past her lips. A trickle of panic fluttered in her stomach. She closed her eyes for a moment and pictured her mother's face, warm, encouraging, and took a slow, careful breath. When Zuri opened her eyes again, Patricia had finished with the man in the suit and straightened. The attendant's gaze swept back toward the middle of the cabin, but instead of checking the call light, she made eye contact with a woman in row 15 and said, "Anything else for you, ma'am?" Her tone was friendly, inclusive. Just not for Zuri. A lump rose in Zuri's throat. She reached for her water bottle, sitting snugly in her backpack on the floor at her feet, but the zippered pouch wouldn't budge beneath the seat in front of her. She tugged at it futilely, cursing softly under her breath. She didn't want to make a scene, but her lungs were burning. She needed to take her antihistamine. The medicine was useless if she couldn't wash it down. Zuri glanced at the pale blue pillow on her seat and hugged it against her chest. She met the eyes of the passenger next to her, a businesswoman tapping on her laptop, and felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. The woman gave her a sympathetic look but quickly looked away, as if she too lacked the courage to intervene. The murmur of the cabin seemed to swell around Zuri, and she felt alone on a sea of indifferent faces. Her breathing became shallower, and a dry cough escaped her lips. She gripped the armrests to steady herself, every muscle in her body tense. She thought, "If I close my eyes, maybe this will pass," but the rasp in her throat only worsened. She closed her eyes tightly and squeezed her pillow until her knuckles turned white. Suddenly, Patricia reappeared beside the beverage cart, polishing a tray with brisk, precise movements. She glanced up, saw the blinking call light, and sighed, a sound loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. She called out, "Miss Anderson, I said you'll get water on the next service round." Her voice carried a note of impatience, as though Zuri's health were a trivial inconvenience. Zuri blinked back tears. Next service round. How many more minutes before that arrived? She swallowed again, trying to ease the tickle at the back of her throat. She managed a whisper, almost under her breath. "Please, I really need water." For a heartbeat, Patricia hesitated, just enough that Zuri thought maybe she'd relent, but instead the attendant's lips curved into a dismissive smirk. "We have procedures," she said, loud enough that a hush fell over 3 or 4 rows. "If you want water, come to the galley after we finish this cart." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Zuri's plea hanging in the stale air. A flight attendant named Lewis, passing by, shot Zuri a quick glance of concern. He paused, then moved on, wringing his hands behind his back. Zuri realized it wasn't his place to overrule a senior attendant. The power imbalance felt crushing. She bit her lip and tried to steady her breathing again. The man in 16A laughed at something on his phone. Patricia's laughter followed. Zuri looked out the window and watched wispy white clouds drift by. They seemed innocent, untouching, unlike the walls closing in on her from every side. She pictured her aunt's bright Victorian home, warm fireplaces, big glass windows, and a tall silver water pitcher standing by the dining table. That memory was a comfort she clung to, even as the cabin felt colder. She thought of her mom one last time. "You're stronger than you think," her mother's voice echoed. Zuri lifted her head, hands still trembling, and whispered, "I can do this." She let go of the armrests and leaned back, closing her eyes. Minutes later, the beverage cart had passed her row. Zuri felt certain she'd wait forever. When the cart came back, Patricia was nowhere in sight. She'd disappeared into the crowd of seats ahead. As the lights flickered on in preparation for a service break, Zuri pressed the call button again, even though she knew Patricia would ignore it. She clutched her pillow tighter. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Zuri saw movement. A pair of hands reaching for her water bottle in the overhead bin. A soft, guiding voice said, "Here." She opened her eyes to see the woman sitting beside her, handing down the familiar bottle. No words were spoken, just a simple act of kindness. Zuri's breath caught in her throat, half relief, half gratitude. She took the bottle and tipped her head back, letting water cascade over her dry lips. The medicine followed easily, and within seconds, the tightness in her chest began to ease. She looked at the woman, whose silver hair was softly curled around her shoulders, and managed a small, thankful smile. The woman nodded, her eyes warm but composed, before settling back into her seat and opening a thick leather-bound folder. Zuri closed her eyes again, letting the water and medicine work their magic. For the first time since takeoff, she felt seen, and though she still trembled, she realized that sometimes compassion spoke louder than any announcement over the peak. As the plane soared higher into the sky, Zuri clutched that water bottle like a lifeline. She didn't know the woman's name yet, but Zuri vowed she would never forget this moment. The moment when someone chose to help without being asked twice. In that silence, she found new strength. The cabin lights stayed gently dimmed as the beverage cart rolled past row after row. Zuri watched its wheels squeak over the gray carpet from her seat in 17B, her throat itching unbearably with each passing second. Every time she swallowed, it felt like sandpaper scraping the back of her throat. She pressed the call button once, then twice, each blink of the tiny light above her head feeling like a plea for rescue. But Patricia Vaughn was nowhere in sight. Moments later, Patricia's sharp heels clicked as she re-emerged from the galley, balancing a tray of cold cans and ice buckets. Zuri's heart pounded as she braced herself and lifted her hand. The attendant's eyes flicked toward the blinking indicator, but she only cocked her head and sighed. "You again?" Patricia called, her voice flat. "Listen, sweetheart, we don't have enough bottled water on board to pass out to every single passenger." With that, she turned deliberately to the man in 16A white, middle-aged and reading the newspaper, and offered him a can of sparkling water with an apologetic smile. Zuri's empty cup sat on her tray table as silent proof of her exclusion. Zuri's chest constricted. She clutched the armrests until her knuckles whitened, fighting back tears. How could Patricia say there wasn't enough when she watched that man get served immediately? The inequity felt like a punch to her ribs. She forced herself to swallow again, bile rising. Her medicine, a small antihistamine pill, sat uselessly on her lap, unwashed and useless. She needed water now, not in the next service round, which could be hours away. She glanced up and caught the eye of a woman in 15C, who quickly looked away. A teenage boy in 14B nudged his friend, whispering under his breath as he pointed at Zuri's trembling lip. On any other day, Zuri might have mustered a polite smile, but right now, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes judging her. She wasn't a child demanding candy, she was fighting for her breath. Zuri shifted uncomfortably and tried to unzip her backpack on the floor. Her fingers fumbled with the zipper pull as Patricia continued serving, this time to a young couple across the aisle. The couple exchanged cheerful hellos with Patricia and received full cups with ice. Zuri's pouch of essentials, her inhaler, cough drops, and an emergency water bottle, was buried deep beneath travel guides and a half-eaten granola bar. She yanked at the fabric, stumbling over her words. "Excuse me, could I get some water now?" Patricia paused, narrowing her eyes, her lips curled into a mocking smirk. "You see that bin back there?" she asked, gesturing to the overhead lockers. "Feel free to get up and retrieve whatever you packed. I've got more important things to do than cater to every single cough." She turned her back before Zuri could respond, her shoulders squared. The cart rattled onward, leaving a trail of cold emptiness behind. A sudden cough racked Zuri's body, low and rattling. She covered her mouth, her vision blurring with tears. Her heart raced in terror. What if she couldn't hold on until the next round? She remembered her mother's steady voice. "You know you're stronger than you think." She repeated it silently like a mantra and took a trembling breath. Somewhere ahead, another white passenger called for assistance, and Patricia appeared instantly, offering a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Zuri watched as the passenger nodded gratefully. The sight felt like a cruel reminder of her own helplessness. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling her pulse thumping wildly. Her inhaler was still out of reach, and each second felt like an hour. Zuri forced herself to look out the window. The sky was a brilliant cerulean, sunlight glinting off wisps of cloud. She could almost imagine herself soaring above these struggles, weightless and free. But the cabin was cramped, stained by the stale hush of injustice. She clenched her fist, her fingernails digging into her palm. She wouldn't break. She couldn't afford to. Then Patricia's voice rang out again, louder this time. "Any more demands, young lady?" A hush fell. Zuri summoned all her courage and met Patricia's gaze. "I'm not demanding anything extra," she said, her voice quivering. "I just need the water I'm entitled to, like everyone else." A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. She felt every head turn, every breath in the cabin halting to listen. Patricia tilted her chin and let out a slow, condescending laugh, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Entitled," she echoed. "You think you deserve special treatment because you can't handle a minor inconvenience?" She looked about to scold her further, but something in Zuri's steady eyes gave her pause. For an instant, the entire plane held its breath. Then Patricia lifted her muscular forearm and pointed dramatically down the aisle. "If you keep this up, I'll make sure you're reported. We'll have security waiting when we land. They'll see how disruptive you've been." Her tone was low, full of dark promise. Zuri's stomach churned. The threat stung more than the hot tears now sliding down her cheeks. Zuri swallowed against the lump in her throat. The humiliation burned hotter than her dry cough. She nodded once, willing herself not to cry out. The cart jingled as it continued forward. Patricia moved on to another seat, leaving Zuri's cup still empty. Zuri pressed her forehead against the window, trapping her reflection there. Small, teary-eyed but unbroken. She placed one hand over her heart and took a measured breath, almost tasting the freedom of air. She thought of her aunt's warm welcome in San Francisco, of cold water in a sunlit kitchen. For now, she would endure. She would survive this injustice because that was what real strength looked like. Standing tall, even when everyone else tried to push you down. And so, with a trembling chin and unwavering resolve, Zuri waited, waiting for someone to remember her humanity. And for the moment, when justice would finally arrive, Zuri sat rigidly in her 17B seat as the cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow. Her throat still burned from the coarse antihistamine she had forced down without water, and every swallow felt like dragging sandpaper across her vocal cords. She pressed the call button again, her fingertip trembling, but the attendant's heels tapped farther down the aisle, serving smiling passengers with mechanical courtesy. The sparkle of ice cubes in fragile glasses caught the overhead lights, mocking her empty cup. She glanced sideways at the woman in 17A, an older passenger with silver hair loosely curled around her shoulders and a patterned scarf draped elegantly over her coat. The woman wore simple gold-rimmed eyeglasses and was absorbed in a leather-bound journal, her pen scratching quietly at soothing lines of text. Zuri didn't know her name, but the gentle tilt of her head suggested she was paying attention. Zuri's heart clenched as a fresh cough rattled her chest. Her inhaler sat buried at the bottom of her bag, unreachable. She pressed her fingers into her temples, willing the urge to subside. But when her gaze flicked back to 17A, the woman quietly closed her journal, tucked the pen away, and lifted a small plastic bottle of water from her own tote bag. Zuri blinked in surprise. The woman did not call over the attendant or clear her throat. She simply held out the bottle, uncapped it, and offered it across the narrow armrest. Zuri hesitated. She had learned to be cautious, to stand on her own 2 feet. But her cough jolted through her like a warning, and she reached out, taking the bottle with both hands. "Thank you," Zuri managed, her voice raspy. The woman offered a soft nod, her blue-gray eyes warm but unreadable. She said nothing more. Zuri lifted the bottle and tipped it slowly, letting cool water flow over her parched lips and down her throat. Relief blossomed through her chest, an almost painful sweetness of hydration. She closed her eyes and savored the sensation, each sip easing the tightness in her lungs. She could have drunk the entire thing, but she paced herself, mindful of every drop. As the water settled, she unscrewed the cap and swallowed her pill, feeling it glide easily down. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The tension in her shoulders loosened, and she lowered her head to hide the flush of gratitude and embarrassment warming her cheeks. Around them, the cabin continued its routine hum, passengers reading magazines, checking phones, and whispering to travel companions. No one seemed to notice the quiet exchange, yet in that small gesture, the entire dynamic of the flight shifted for Zuri. She felt seen, acknowledged, and, most importantly, human again. She turned back to the stranger beside her, wanting to say more, but the woman was already retrieving her journal. With a brief, encouraging smile, she flipped it open to a fresh page and resumed writing as if nothing had happened. That casual compassion struck Zuri more powerfully than any grand speech ever could. Moments later, Patricia appeared at the end of the beverage cart, checking her checklist with efficient detachment. She glanced in Zuri's direction, noticed the bottle, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Patricia's gaze flicked from Zuri to the woman beside her, an unspoken question in her eyes. The woman met Patricia's stare calmly, her posture unflinching. Patricia weighed the situation. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though she might intervene to assert control, but then she shook her head and looked away, directing her attention to another passenger. The act of quiet defiance, Zuri realized, was as powerful as any confrontation. Patricia had chosen not to challenge the woman, implicitly acknowledging that her authority had limits. Zuri unclenched her fists and relaxed back into the seat, her heart still pounding but steadier than before. The water had restored not just her breath, but a sense of dignity. She studied the stranger's calm confidence, the way she held her pen, the gentle upturn of her lips when she paused to look out the window at the rolling clouds. Gathering courage, Zuri piped up softly. "Were you a nurse or something? You just knew what I needed." The woman paused mid-word on her journal entry and offered a small smile. "No," she said quietly, her voice warm and melodic. "Just someone who believes we should look out for each other. It's nothing fancy." Zuri nodded, glancing at her reflection in the window. She studied the way her shoulders had relaxed, the pale pink shimmer of tears that had dried at the corners of her eyes. She felt stronger already, buoyed by someone's simple act of kindness. The woman settled back into her seat and folded her journal shut. Then, from the inside pocket of her blazer, she withdrew a small packet of lemon candies and held them out to Zuri. "For the throat," she said. Zuri's eyes filled with tears once more, tears of relief, gratitude, and an unexpected warmth. She took 2 candies and tucked them into her mouth, savoring the tart sweetness that soothed the scratchiness in her voice. She looked up to thank the woman properly, but when she blinked, the older passenger was already turning a page in her journal, her expression serene and thoughtful. Zuri leaned back, smiling to herself. She felt a spark of hope she hadn't experienced since boarding. The flight felt less like a lonely ordeal and more like a journey, one where allies might be hidden in plain sight. She realized that sometimes, The most powerful support came not from grand gestures, but from the quiet moments. A shared bottle of water, a handful of candies, a reassuring nod. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Zuri felt a newfound resolve settling in her chest. This trip would be more than just a visit to her aunt's home. It would mark the moment she remembered her own worth, even when others tried to strip it away. And she knew, deep down, that she would carry this small kindness with her long after the flight ended. The sky outside stretched wide and welcoming, and for the first time on this journey, Zuri dared to smile. Patricia Vaughn reappeared at the beverage cart with a purposeful stride, her heels clicking against the aisle like a metronome of menace. She paused at row 17, flipping through her checklist as though Zuri were just another tick mark waiting to be crossed off. Zuri sat hunched in 17B, hugging her thin blanket around her shoulders, and dared not look up. Her throat still burned from the antihistamine, but the water she'd been given had eased the worst of the scratchiness, enough that she felt brave enough to meet Patricia's gaze, even if just for an instant. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she noticed the half-empty bottle in Zuri's hand. Her lips curled into a mocking smirk. "Who told you to accept that water?" she barked, voice sharp enough to slice through the cabin's hush. "This isn't a charity flight. You think you're special just because you've got a sad story?" She jabbed a finger at Zuri's chest. The motion made Zuri flinch. Heat flooded Zuri's cheeks. She traced a trembling line down her arm, straight to her clutched bottle. No one else would have dared intercept that simple kindness, and now the attendant was punishing her for it. She pressed her lips together and shook her head once, eyes fixed on her lap. The silence that followed felt heavy, like a dam holding back a flood of emotion. Patricia stepped closer, and Zuri could smell the faint scent of her perfume, sharp, floral, almost overpowering in the recycled air. "If you think you're going to get special treatment, think again," Patricia hissed. Around them, passengers turned in their seats. A businessman in 16C sat forward, frowning. A young mother by the window rocked her sleeping infant, concern etched on her face. Zuri swallowed hard. Her voice felt trapped behind an invisible wall. She fought the rising panic in her chest. Panicky enough to trigger her cough again, but managed to whisper, "I just needed water." She couldn't bring herself to add the rest. "To take my medicine," though every fiber of her being ached to. Patricia's nostrils flared. She straightened her shoulders, towering over Zuri. "Don't get emotional," she snapped. "You're wasting my time, and mine is worth a lot more than yours." Her meaning was clear. Zuri's life, her very breath, were nothing compared to Patricia's schedule. The words hit Zuri like a physical blow. Zuri's vision blurred, not from the cough, but from the sting of Patricia's insult. She blinked rapidly, willing the tears away. She thought of her mother back in Dallas, sleeping off her surgery, expecting her to be safe. This was supposed to be a celebration of recovery. Instead, Zuri felt smaller than she'd ever felt. Like a piece of trash tossed aside. Her breath caught. She forced herself to look up, meeting Patricia's cold eyes. "Is it because I'm black?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. They were soft, more a tremor than a challenge, but the honesty in them rang through the aisle like a bell. Patricia's mouth snapped shut. For a heartbeat, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. Even the hum of the engines faded. Then Patricia's face twisted into an expression of fury and disbelief. "Don't drag race into this," she spat. "I don't have time for your race card." She threw her clipboard down onto the cart with such force that the tray rattled, ice cubes dancing in their bucket. Several heads swung toward them. A woman 2 rows back gasped. A preteen boy cocked his head, eyes wide. Zuri's heart thundered, but she remained rooted to her seat, her spine stiff and straight. The humiliation was searing, but beneath it burned a tiny ember of defiance. Patricia straightened her apron with a sharp tug and looked down her nose at Zuri. "You think life plays fair just because you can call attention to yourself?" she muttered. Her tone was low, venomous. "Don't push your luck, kid." Then she spun on her heel and stalked away, leaving her words hanging in the recycled air. A hush fell over row 17. Zuri closed her eyes tightly and pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to quell the thunder in her head. But when she opened them again, she caught the eye of the woman in 17A, Dr. Rivers, who gave her a small, steady nod. Zuri felt the ember inside her flare into a small spark of relief. A nearby passenger leaned over and offered a silent thumbs up before retreating. Another man, a professor by the look of his tweed jacket, quietly slipped a handkerchief out of his pocket and lay it across Zuri's lap. Not an apology in words, but an acknowledgement that what happened wasn't right. Zuri drew in a shuddering breath and lifted the handkerchief to her face, dabbing at her eyes. The gesture reminded her of her mother's tender ways, always cleaning scraped knees gently, always offering comfort without judgment. She clutched the fabric and let herself feel two things at once: the sting of Patricia's cruelty and the warmth of the small kindnesses blossoming around her. Behind her, the flight attendant Louise hovered for a moment, looking torn. He wore the same uniform as Patricia, but with a friendlier cut. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders sagging. Zuri realized he couldn't override his supervisor, no matter how badly he wanted to help. She straightened her spine and whispered, "Thank you," to the professor. Then she tucked the handkerchief into her jacket pocket for later. Each small act of compassion felt like a lifeline. Even though Patricia tried to break her, Zuri found strength in those quiet alliances forming in the cabin. As Patricia served yet another passenger, Zuri watched her lean into a flamboyant apology for a spilled drink, her empathy flowing freely for any traveler except Zuri. The injustice of it stung, but Zuri squared her shoulders. She'd come too far to let this break her. She drew in slow, measured breaths, remembering her mother's mantra: "Stand tall and ask for what you need." And though Patricia's words still echoed like a slap, Zuri knew she wouldn't let them define her. She would keep standing. She would keep speaking. And when the time came, someone powerful would step in, and justice, at last, would have its day. A tense hush settled over the economy cabin the moment Patricia Vaughn stalked away, her heels clicking like a warning bell. Zuri's breath caught as passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging concerned glances. The overhead bins rattled faintly as the plane continued its steady hum, but the atmosphere felt electric. Every eye tuned in to the charged space around row 17. Zuri pressed her fingers to her lips, still trembling from Patricia's venomous words. A cold knot of fear buzzed in her stomach, but beneath it flickered something stronger, the spark of her own defiance. She lifted her chin and stared straight ahead, determined not to shrink back again. Her throat throbbed, but she reminded herself that each moment she endured was a testament to her own courage. Several rows down, a businesswoman clasped her purse strap and leaned forward, whispering to her husband. A little girl in row 19 pressed her forehead against the window, wide-eyed. Even the flight attendants in the aisle paused in their tasks, uncertainty flickering on their faces. It was as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Then, just as the tension threatened to crack, the silver-hailed woman beside Zuri, Dr. Charlene Rivers, shifted in her seat. Zuri had seen her reading a leather-bound journal earlier, but now Dr. Rivers straightened, as if awakened by some inner cue. She removed her glasses and tucked them into her blazer pocket. The motion was simple, almost casual, yet it carried the weight of someone accustomed to command. Dr. Rivers closed her journal with deliberate calm, then turned her full attention to Patricia, who was mid-step between rows. Patricia froze. She blinked once, as though seeing Dr. Rivers for the very first time. The polished confidence in Dr. Rivers's eyes made Patricia's own expressions falter. Silence stretched thicker than any quilt. "Ms. Vaughn?" Dr. Rivers's voice rang out, measured and cool. "I've been observing your conduct this entire flight." She paused, letting those words land like stones in still water. "You are the lead flight attendant in this cabin, yet you have repeatedly denied basic care to a young passenger simply because of her race." Patricia's cheeks drained of color. Her crisp navy blazer stiffened on her shoulders. She swallowed, lips parting as if to protest, but no words came. Around them, passengers sat frozen, eyes fixed on Patricia and Dr. Rivers. A collective sense of disbelief rippled through the cabin. Dr. Rivers lifted one hand, palm outward, and addressed everyone quietly but firmly. "Flight Attendant Vaughn is relieved of her duties for the remainder of this flight. Ms. Rivers is authorizing a temporary reassignment. She will report to the crew rest area until we land." She nodded toward a junior attendant standing near the galleys. "Carter, please escort Ms. Vaughn back to the crew quarters." Carter Wilson, a younger flight attendant with sympathetic eyes, stepped forward hesitantly, then moved decisively to Patricia's side. Patricia's jaw clenched as Carter gently placed a hand on her arm and steered her toward the curtain that hid the crew rest area. With every step, Patricia's authority unraveled, and the cabin watched, riveted, as the once untouchable lead attendant disappeared from view. Zuri's shoulders sank in relief. She let out a breath she'd been holding and turned toward Dr. Rivers. Tears pricked at her eyes, not from fear but from gratitude so deep it felt like light flooding her chest. The other passengers began to murmur words of support, a soft, "good for you, kid," a hesitant round of applause, even a few tears from strangers moved by the spectacle of justice unfolding at 35,000 feet. Dr. Rivers closed the space between them and laid a gentle hand on Zuri's arm. "You were brave to speak up," she said softly. "No child should ever be denied the care they need." Her voice carried the warmth of genuine compassion, the kind that only someone who had navigated boardrooms and crises could offer. Zuri managed a shaky smile. "Thank you, Doc?" she began. "Rivers, Charlene Rivers." The older woman offered her journal. "If you ever doubt yourself, read these pages. They're filled with stories of people doing what's right, even when it's hard." Zuri accepted the journal reverently, the leather smooth under her fingers. She looked back at the aisle, where Carter stood guard and Patricia lingered just beyond the curtain, her head bowed. The cabin buzzed with a new energy, an unspoken promise that cruelty and prejudice would no longer go unchecked. As Dr. Rivers and Zuri shared a final encouraging nod, the rest of the cabin began to cling a little closer to each other, strangers forming a fleeting community bound by empathy. Zuri tucked the journal into her lap and pressed her hand over her heart, feeling the steady thrum of her own bravery. Outside, a curtain of clouds parted under a golden sun, as though the sky itself were celebrating. Inside, at the heart of the plane, justice had arrived in the most unlikely form. Not with a shout, but with the unwavering authority of someone who knew exactly when to reveal her power and how to use it. The cabin fell into a hush so complete you could hear the soft thrum of the engines humming beneath everyone's seats. Patricia Vaughn, once a pillar of authority striding through these aisles, stood frozen in mid-step as Dr. Charlene Rivers regarded her with cool, unwavering calm. In that moment, time seemed to slow for every passenger in economy. An expectant pause before the scales of power shifted irrevocably. Dr. Rivers tapped the armrest lightly, drawing everyone's attention. "Ms. Vaughn," she said, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that filled the space. "You have repeatedly refused essential care to a child under my watch. That is unacceptable." Her tone was neither angry nor indulgent. It was simply factual, absolute. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight. Heads turned. Passengers blinked. Even the flight attendants paused behind their carts, surprised to see protocol enforced so swiftly. Carter Wilson, the junior attendant who had lingered by the galley, stepped forward with a gentle professionalism. He placed a respectful hand on Patricia's elbow. "I'll escort you to the crew rest area, ma'am," he said. Patricia's mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. Her eyes flicked to the curtain concealing the crew quarters, then back to Dr. Rivers. For the first time that flight, she looked uncertain, her crisp uniform and stern demeanor unable to mask the shock on her face. Zuri Anderson, seated by the window in 17B, felt her heart pound in her chest. Relief mingled with awe as she watched Carter lead Patricia away. The stern flight attendant stumbled slightly, her confident stride reduced to stumbling steps as she passed row after row of onlookers. She offered no rebuttal, no desperate plea, just a silent acceptance of the verdict delivered by someone with higher authority. As Patricia crossed the threshold into the crew rest area, a ripple of hushed applause moved through the cabin. A middle-aged woman in row 12 covered her mouth in surprise, then gave a small, conspiratorial smile. A young father leaned toward his toddler, whispering, "That's how you stand up for the little ones." The atmosphere, once pinned down by tension and cruelty, now buzzed with an electric energy of solidarity. Dr. Rivers turned back to Zuri with a kind, understanding smile. She moved down the aisle with deliberate grace, each step measured as if crossing a courtroom. Reaching row 17, she knelt beside Zuri's seat, careful not to loom. "You did the right thing," she said softly, placing a supportive hand on Zuri's shoulder. "It takes real courage to stand up when you're scared." Zuri's chest tightened. Gratitude and disbelief warred within her. She managed a small nod. "Thank you," she whispered. I didn't know what else to do." Dr. Rivers reached into her leather tote and pulled out the leather-bound journal she'd been writing in earlier. "Here," she said, pressing it into Zuri's hands. "This has pages of stories. Stories of people who chose what was right, even when it was hard. I want you to read it when you need a reminder of your own strength." Zuri cradled the journal like a precious gift, her fingers brushing the embossed initials on the cover. She looked up at Dr. Rivers, her eyes glistening. "I will," she promised, "and I'll remember your kindness, too." Dr. Rivers stood and nodded toward the rest of the cabin. "Please, everyone," she addressed all the passengers, "let this be a reminder that compassion and justice matter in the air and on the ground. Thank you for your support." A gentle wave of applause followed, louder and more heartfelt than before. Strangers applauded strangers, a shared acknowledgement that what had happened to Zuri should never happen to any child. From the galley emerged Luis, the junior attendant who had looked on with guilt. He crossed to Dr. Rivers' side, giving her a respectful nod before continuing on his duties. Behind him, the usual rhythm of service resumed. Drink requests, snack orders, but now performed with a new warmth, as if every attendant had been reminded of the humanity behind every seat number. Zuri sat up straighter, clutching the journal to her chest. She felt buoyed by the communal support, as if the entire cabin had formed a protective shield around her. She opened the cover briefly and saw notes in neat handwriting, reflections on fairness, passages about standing tall, stories of ordinary people who spoke truth to power. She slid it closed with reverent care. Ahead of her, Through the aisle, she caught glimpses of Patricia, seated in the cramped crew rest area, her head pressed against the wall, shoulders hunched in defeat. No one went near her. The crew gave her space, understanding that today, the lines between authority and morality had been redrawn. A seatbelt sign chimed softly as the captain prepared for a slight course adjustment. Zuri leaned back, feeling the movement beneath her feet. She realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled fully, a shuddering sigh of relief. Her muscles, so tense moments ago, relaxed as she allowed herself a genuine smile. Even though the flight still had hours to go, Zuri no longer felt alone. She had spoken up and seen justice done. In a quiet, powerful way, she had witnessed the highest authority on this plane restore dignity to someone who needed it most. And in doing so, she'd discovered a strength within herself she never knew she had. Dr. Rivers rose and gave Zuri one final nod before returning to her seat. Zuri waved shyly, then opened the journal to the first page as she read the words that Dr. Rivers had penned. So many affirmations of bravery, compassion, and accountability. She felt something bloom in her heart. The conviction that no matter what, she would always stand up for what was right, and that sometimes true leadership meant wielding power with kindness. Above her, the sky stretched endless and bright, a reminder that the world beyond these cabin walls was vast and full of possibility. And in that moment, Zuri Anderson understood that one person's courage could ripple outward, touching everyone around her, even 35,000 feet in the air. A soft murmur rippled through the economy cabin as the applause for Dr. Rivers' decisive actions slowly faded. The engine's hum felt suddenly louder, an almost sympathetic backdrop to the collective exhale of passengers who had held their breath for far too long. In the moments after Patricia Vaughn's removal, an invisible weight lifted from the aisle, and the faces that had once looked away now turned toward row 17. From row 12, a gray-haired man in a fleece pullover leaned forward and cleared his throat softly. His voice was quiet but earnest. "Miss," he said, addressing Zuri without using her name, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." He nodded once, head dipping in respectful apology. Zuri felt heat rush to her cheeks, not from embarrassment this time, but from an unexpected swell of relief. She managed a small smile and mouthed, "Thank you." That single apology seemed to unlock something. A woman 2 rows ahead, dressed in a floral scarf and holding a knitting project, slid to the edge of her seat. "Me too," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw it happen and thought it wasn't my place." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded cotton handkerchief, then slipped it quietly into Zuri's lap without a word. Again, no one told her to do it. She simply followed her heart. Nearby, a man in a crisp button-down shirt closed his laptop and turned toward Zuri. He slid out of his seat and, with a shy smile, offered her the window seat beside him. "This one's mine," he said, gesturing to the middle seat he'd occupied. "You deserve a better view at least." Zuri's eyes widened. She tried to protest, but he shook his head gently. "Please, you earned it." He didn't need permission from anyone. A ripple of appreciative chuckles followed as other passengers watched the small act of kindness. Moments later, the woman who had handed Zuri water in Chapter 5, Dr. Rivers' seatmate, now revealed to be named Dorothy Chambers, leaned over again. "If you need anything, dear," Mrs. Chambers said softly, "just ask." She patted Zuri's shoulder, then returned to her own seat, her knitting needles clicking. Zuri felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. Each gesture of solidarity was a brick laid in place of the barrier Patricia had built. Across the aisle, the pre-med student who had first tried to help Zuri now leaned in with a bottle of juice. "You might need a little sugar after all that stress," she offered. The boy beside her, who'd earlier recorded the incident on his phone, slipped his earbuds into his pocket, looked around sheepishly, then added, I'm glad I captured the truth." He tapped his phone, but no one asked him to. He simply felt compelled to stand by what was right. Oddly, the cabin felt warmer now, as if those shared moments of compassion had lit small lamps at every seat. The flight attendants resumed service, but this time they did so with something like respect in their eyes, reminding Zuri that she was not invisible. When the beverage cart rolled by, Louis gave a quick nod and stacked the empty cups behind him, signaling that the next round of water was on him. Zuri pressed her journal, Dr. Rivers' gift, against her chest and took a steadying breath. She looked around at the faces that had once turned away, now open and attentive. She realized that these people had changed, however briefly, because she had spoken up. She had shifted the current of their empathy. In that spontaneous community of strangers, Zuri discovered a profound lesson. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the gentle chorus of quiet voices saying, "I see you," and "I'm sorry," and "let me help." And at 35,000 feet in the air, she felt grounded by something stronger than fear. The knowledge that doing what's right can inspire others, even when they believe they're powerless. As the plane hummed onward toward San Francisco, Zuri closed her eyes and let those soft voices carry her forward. Proof that justice can blossom in the smallest acts of kindness, and that the most powerful solidarity often comes from hearts willing to speak up, no matter how quietly. There was a gentle ripple of excitement as the cabin crew began to reset the beverage cart, and the hush that had fallen after the solidarity of Chapter 9 gave way to something new: anticipation. Zuri Anderson sat forward in her economy seat, journal clutched in her lap, and watched Dr. Charlene Rivers rise from 17A with a confident grace that seemed to bend the very air around her. The older woman adjusted her blazer and tapped lightly on her Infleet tablet. In a clear, even voice, she called, "Miss Anderson, would you join me in first class?" Zuri's heart caught in her throat. She blinked at Dr. Rivers, unbelieving. Passengers 2 rows back stirred, and a soft ooh drifted through the cabin. Zuri opened her mouth to protest. She'd never dreamed of such a request. But the lattice of fear and excitement in her chest tightened until she could only nod. "Yes, thank you," she managed. The words sounded small, but inside Zuri felt as though she were stretching taller, free of the weight that had pressed on her since takeoff. Carter Wilson, the junior attendant who'd escorted Patricia away, emerged from the galley and offered Zuri his arm. He smiled warmly. "Right this way, Miss Anderson," he said. The aisle suddenly felt like a parade route as Zuri stood, smoothed her jacket, and took a tentative step out of 17B. Heads turned. Some passengers offered polite applause, others simply smiled. Zuri held Carter's arm as they walked, her knuckles white but her chin lifted. At the curtain dividing economy from first class, Carter drew it back with a flourish. The air beyond was brighter. Soft, overhead lights cast a warm glow across plush leather seats arranged in pairs, each with extra legroom and gleaming wooden trays. The carpet was deep navy, and the cabin buzzed with an almost reverent calm. A flight attendant stationed at the front gave Zuri a respectful nod before silently returning to duty. Dr. Rivers stood and gestured to a vacant seat in the second row of first class, directly beside her own. "This seat is yours, Zuri," she said gently. Zuri stepped forward, her shoes making no sound on the thick carpet, and lowered herself into the wide cushioned chair. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The leather felt cool and luxurious beneath her fingers. She reached out to touch the embroidered Pacific Jet logo on the headrest and whispered, "Wow." Dr. Rivers settled into her own seat and leaned back, studying Zuri with a look of genuine regard. "You deserve more than the bare minimum," she said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who had spent decades making high-stakes decisions. You deserved water when you needed it, and more than that, you deserved to feel safe. I want you here so you can see firsthand how we'll make sure no one else is treated that way." Zuri looked around at the pristine surroundings. Individual reading lamps, a small entertainment screen tucked into each armrest, a basket of fresh fruit waiting on a side table. She glanced at Dr. Rivers and felt a surge of confidence. "Ms. Rivers," she said, "thank you. I've never sat in first class before." Her voice wavered with emotion. Dr. Rivers smiled kindly. "Then let's make this worth your while." She tapped her tablet twice, and the attendant at the front rolled forward a small cart with chilled bottled water, warm towels, and a selection of herbal teas. Carter reappeared with a silver tray holding an array of fresh berries and tiny sandwiches. The service felt almost ceremonial, a clear contrast to the indifference Zuri had endured just moments ago. As Zuri sipped a cool glass of water, she felt the last remnants of panic dissolve. Each sip washed away the dry scratchiness in her throat and replaced it with a sense of belonging. She noticed Carter pausing respectfully at each pair of seats beyond, offering passengers everything from fresh juice to noise-canceling headphones. The crew moved with an attentiveness that looked effortless but was undoubtedly the result of precise training. And now, Dr. Rivers's direct over. Dr. Rivers leaned closer, lowering her voice to a confidential whisper. "I want you to help me document what happened. Your perspective matters. You're a witness, and your voice will guide the changes we implement." She tapped a few notes into her tablet. "We're going to overhaul the complaint process, train every flight attendant on bias awareness, and make sure management hears directly from passengers who experience discrimination." Zuri's eyes widened. The journal on her lap felt suddenly inadequate for capturing the magnitude of this moment. She fumbled for a pen and opened to the first clean page. I can't believe this," she said softly. "I never imagined I'd have a part in something so big." Dr. Rivers offered her the pen. "Believe it," she replied. "You've already changed the course of this company. Now you'll help shape its future." She placed a reassuring hand on Zuri's arm. No one should ever feel powerless at 35,000 feet. Outside the window, the cotton-white clouds stretched in an endless sea below. Zuri pressed her journal to her chest and took a deep breath, letting the sight of the sky's vast openness fill her with hope. She realized that rising into first class wasn't just about comfort. It was a symbol that justice could elevate the overlooked, that kindness could rewrite someone's story. Carter returned to remove the empty glass and set down a fresh cup of tea scented with chamomile. Zuri gave him a grateful smile. He nodded. "It's my pleasure," he said quietly. Dr. Rivers sat back, her gaze warm with pride. "You've done well, Zuri," she said. "Remember this feeling. Use it as fuel whenever you have to stand up again." Zuri closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the tingling warmth in her chest. When she opened them, she met Dr. Rivers's steady gaze and said, "I will. Thank you. For everything." As the plane cruised toward San Francisco, the first-class cabin felt like a safe harbor above the clouds. Zuri flipped open her journal and began to write. "Today, I sat beside the person who runs this airline." And she listened. Each word flowed easily now, carried by the knowledge that her voice mattered and would continue to matter long after this flight touched down. The moment the plane's wheels touched down in San Francisco, the cabin seemed to exhale as one. Passengers stood, stretched, and gathered their things, but a different kind of buzz filled the air, one born not of arrival but of something electric and unstoppable: gossip. As flight attendants tucked away their carts and cleared their stations, a flurry of discreet phone taps and furtive glances rippled through the crew. Louise, who'd lingered near the galley, popped his head into the crew rest area and whispered, "Did you see what happened back there?" Carter Wilson glanced up from his notes, eyebrows raised. From just beyond the curtain, a junior attendant named Maya peeked in. "I got the whole thing on video," she said, voice low. "They're already sharing clips in the Pacific Jet staff group chat." Carter's jaw tightened. He knew that chat was supposed to be private, a place for shift swaps and uniform reminders, not eyewitness footage of a lead attendant getting relieved by the airline's chairwoman. Meanwhile, in the terminal, baggage handlers clustered around their handheld radios. "Yeah," one said, voice hushed. "Pac Jet 314 had Dr. Rivers front and center, personally reassigning Vaughn mid-flight." The others exchanged incredulous looks. A ramp supervisor overheard the tail end and shook his head. "Next thing you know, they'll be forwarding internal memos to the entire company," he muttered, and they would. Within minutes, that radio snippet was retold at luggage belts, in crew lounges, and over coffee carts. Back in the crew lounge, a group of flight attendants huddled over a tablet streaming a grainy video of the incident. Someone had cleverly censored passenger faces, but not Patricia's uniform. "That's her," one whispered. "That's Vaughn." A snort of disgust followed. "She's been sketchy for months," another replied. "I'm not surprised it finally blew up." Suddenly, policy briefings and diversity training sessions took on new urgency. Whispers of mandatory bias awareness workshops floated through the room. Upstairs, at Pacific Jet headquarters, the internal Slack channel, crew situously went nuts. Notifications pinged relentlessly as employees from every department weighed in. A recruiter in Atlanta posted, "Just heard from my sister, a gate agent, flying on an alias flight with the chairwoman on board, crazy." A mechanic added a gif of a microphone drop. The chief of operations, who normally kept a stoic digital presence, posted a single line, "We will address this transparently." Within seconds, hundreds of reactions lit up beneath it. Even the customer service center felt the tremors. Call center agents, who normally handled ticket changes, found themselves fielding calls from curious passengers, demanding to know if Pacific Jet really stood by its policies. "Yes, ma'am," an agent assured one caller. "Your daughter will never be refused water for medical reasons." On the other line, a corporate partner asked bluntly, "Is this true about your chair intervening in flight operations?" The company line, well rehearsed by PR, had never been tested so quickly. Notes and screenshots circulated to every corner, from ground transportation coordinators to international dispatch teams. The rumor mill, once slow and grinding, now churned at lightning speed. And at the center of it all sat Dr. Rivers and Zuri, still in first class, still sharing that leather-bound journal. Zuri watched guests streaming in to disembark, many offering her congratulatory smiles. She felt a thrill of vindication. Not only had justice played out in the cabin, but it was reshaping the entire company culture before her eyes. As she closed the journal and looked up at Dr. Rivers, Zuri realized that this chapter of change was bigger than a single flight. It had become a catalyst, a story that would echo through Pacific Jet's corridors for months, perhaps years to come. And through every whispered headline and private message, one truth rang clear. When one person speaks up, the whole world can't help but listen. The jet bridge hissed as it connected to the aircraft's door, and the cabin lights brightened to signal the end of their journey. Passengers stirred, gathering belongings and stretching cramped limbs. But Zuri Anderson remained seated beside Dr. Charlene Rivers, clutching the leather-bound journal that had become her talisman. Around them, murmurs of congratulations and smiles of solidarity drifted through the rows, a quiet encore to the cheers and applause that had erupted just an hour earlier. Dr. Rivers leaned close, her silver-streaked hair catching the overhead light. "You did wonderfully, Zuri," she said softly, voice warm with genuine pride. She took Zuri's hand in hers, firm, reassuring. Zuri's heart fluttered, and for a moment she forgot the roar of the engines, the press of bodies around her, even the wide San Francisco tarmac visible through the windows. Zuri looked into Dr. Rivers's steady blue eyes and asked the question that had been on her mind ever since the ordeal began. "Dr. Rivers, if you hadn't been sitting here, what would have happened to me?" Dr. Rivers's gaze softened. She took a breath as though weighing her words carefully. "Someone would have helped you," she replied thoughtfully. "Maybe a fellow passenger, maybe another flight attendant, but they might not have had the power to do what needed to be done." She paused, giving Zuri space to absorb the answer. "Power matters," she continued, "but so does courage. And today, that courage came in many forms. People speaking up, people choosing kindness. But someone in my position had the authority to make real change, and that's why I acted." Zuri nodded slowly, gratitude perched on the edge of her smile. Dr. Rivers squeezed her hand. "The person beside you can make all the difference," she said. "Not because of their title, but because of what they choose to do with their influence. Today it was me, but tomorrow it could be you. Or anyone who sees injustice and decides not to look away." A hush fell over the cabin as Dr. Rivers stood and retrieved her coat from the overhead bin. Flight attendants and passengers alike watched her, recognizing a quiet shift in the air. When she stepped to the front and drew back the curtain separating first class from economy, a gentle wave of applause rose again. This time led by the crew, who offered respectful nods to their new leader. Zuri followed, journal in hand. As she made her way down the aisle, people moved aside, offering polite smiles and whispered words of encouragement. "Nice job, so proud of you. You're amazing." Each acknowledgement lit a spark in her chest, reminding her that action, no matter how small, ripples outward. At the exit door, Dr. Rivers stopped and turned to Zuri one last time. "Remember," she said, voice low and certain, "it's not about the badge you wear. It's about the choice you make when you see someone in need. That choice defines you." Zuri nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She pressed the journal to her heart, then stepped off the plane into the bright San Francisco sunshine. In that moment, she understood that her voice and her courage had not only changed the course of a single flight, but had set in motion a wave of compassion that would carry far beyond 35,000 feet.